For the past 4 years, I've been traveling the world, and on my journey across these continents, I've met countless fascinating individuals who all have different perspectives on life.
I knew from the moment I met those women that I had to tell their stories.
From Olympic athletes who performed at the highest level to artists who create unbelievable work and refugees who have overcome the most difficult of challenges. Each and every single one of them has their own formula for life, and I'm here to find out what that is.
What they wanted, whether they knew it or not, is they wanted to be inspired.
My name is Trevor Carlson, and this is the Formula Podcast.
All right, today on the podcast, I have State Senator Zach Wahls, and I guess you would say you're running for U.S. Senate for the state of Iowa. So welcome to the show, Zach. If we just met for the first time, how would you introduce yourself to someone who doesn't know you?
Well, Trevor, I'm excited to be with you today. It's thanks for having me on the show. Look, we're a candidate for the U.S. Senate. This is essentially, an 18-month job interview. So obviously you want to make a nice first impression, but usually when I connect with folks, I'll just do a quick intro, introduce myself, Zach Wahls, Iowa State Senator over in Coralville, running for the U.S. Senate. And, I'm here today because I want to hear from the people I'm talking with. We obviously have a big state, 99 counties. Folks have totally different life experiences, backgrounds, professions. And I'm always interested in learning more about what's happening in their lives and what they're looking for in their next U.S. Senator.
What are the main things because a lot of people know you from your speech, you said, 10 years, 20 years ago?
15, it was in 2011. So we're kind of 14 and a half. Not that we're counting.
Yeah. So a lot of people were introduced to you during that speech. And I feel like a lot of people in Eastern Iowa know who you are, but for the rest of the people in the state that might not know, what are the key things that you want them to know and understand about you and where you come from?
Sure. But, my story really starts with my mom, Terry, who's a fifth generation Iowa farm girl up in Clayton County, where the Wahls homestead has been in the family for a couple generations. She had me when she was in her early 30s. She's at the time a single lesbian woman, decided she wanted to be a mom, like so many women do. I was born in 1991. My little sister was born a few years later. I grew up in Johnson County, where my tall mom, Terry, she's 6 foot. She's settled a little bit now with age, but she topped out at about 6 foot. And my short mom, Jackie, who's 5'3", raised my sister and me. And growing up, I learned at a pretty early age that politics was interested in families like mine. Having gay parents in the early 2000s was pretty unusual. Even in Johnson County, Iowa City, it wasn't always a cakewalk. And then, when I was in college, I was a civil engineering student at the University of Iowa. I was planning to go build bridges and do kind of projects like that. I spoke at a short hearing before the Iowa legislature about marriage equality. It had been legal in Iowa since 2009. A few years later, some Republican legislators were trying to amend our state constitution to take it away. And I basically just said, look, this is my family. Please don't mess with us. And a video of that speech was uploaded to YouTube, went viral, turned my life totally upside down. I had this choice to make, basically, right? Do I go back to my civil engineering studies or do I keep advocating for families like mine? And ultimately, I thought a lot about how a younger Zach would have answered that question, right? There weren't always advocates for families like mine when I was growing up. And so I knew that 8th grade me would have been very disappointed in college sophomore me if I didn't take advantage of that opportunities. I ended up going across Iowa and ultimately across the country, working on marriage equality issues for several years. And then in 2018, I ran for the Iowa State Senate, where it's hard for me to believe I just wrapped up my 7th legislative session, so 7 years now in the Iowa State Senate, where I've been focused on a multitude of issues, but a lot of issues especially affecting how our state, supports or in some cases doesn't support middle class and working class Iowans, because the number one issue that I hear about from people all over the state is the cost of living is killing so many Iowa families. People are working hard, but they can't get ahead, and we need some real change in our system.
So if we go back to that 19-year-old you're giving, go back and you see that speech. I'm sure you've seen it many times since then, had to talk about it. So I have two questions. If you could go back and talk to that 19-year-old version of yourself, what would you tell them? And the second question is there anything that you would have said differently if you gave that speech now?
Well, let me answer the second question first, which is I wouldn't change a word of it. It was what I felt like I needed to say at the time when I needed to say it, and change even just a little bit of it. Hard to say how my life unfolds from there. That speech was actually how I met my wife, and now the mother of my son. So I wouldn't change a word of it, just because my wife and son are the most important things in my world, and I wouldn't want to have it any other way. In terms of like what would I tell my 19-year-old self? I think if there's maybe I don't know if it would be specific in the context of that speech, but maybe just kind of the broader life, what have you. It's like make sure that you enjoy the journey. It's I know that's kind of a cliched piece of advice, but I think sometimes it's really easy when you've got so much of that stuff going on to feel like you're you got to be focused on the work and what have you, which is true. But also, enjoy yourself along the way and maybe lighten up a little bit. I've been like, maybe this is like a bit of being an older sibling or uh, maybe partly responsible for, I had my mom, Terry, who we might talk about later, was in a wheelchair for several years when I was a teenager. I had to grow up pretty fast. But I think just being able to enjoy yourself a little bit more and loosen up, that would be good advice for 19, 20-year-old Zach.
It seems like you couldn't have really seen what was going to happen like after you gave that speech though, and how things would change, and probably a lot of pressure on basically a late teenager.
Yeah, absolutely. And, yeah, totally unforeseen. I certainly had no idea that was going to happen. I don't think I would have changed anything, even if I had known, obviously, but it certainly was unexpected.
So let's talk about your mom, Dr. Terry Wahls, because she's quite famous for her Wahls protocol. And that was before we started recording. I was asking you if you were an adamant adamant is it Wahls warrior? Is that what they
Yeah,
call
well, yeah, the Walls protocol. Yeah, Walls
it?
Warriors. Yep.
So do you still follow any of her health advice? And I guess what was it like? Because she was like a pretty normally healthy person, mom, and then she got sick with MS, and then she cured herself. From what I understand, she cured herself from using her own protocol, and she did a TED talk that blew up. So that must, I mean, you had a very unique childhood that I think like it's crazy how many different things were going on in your world at once.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I mean, look, she was diagnosed when I was 10, 11 years old. I watched her physical decline into a wheelchair up close and personal. Remember watching her start to stumble and fall more often, some of her motor control, balance, and it was hard to watch, obviously, right? Especially as a kid. I think most of us look at our parents as Superman or whatever, and so to see that happen is obviously hard to watch. And also, just at a very young age, having to take on more responsibility at home, caregiving responsibilities, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And then to watch her refuse to quit, to refuse to give up, to refuse to accept her fate, and to do everything that she could to fight back was, obviously incredible to watch. And, she is fortunate to have been, she's a physician, she's a doctor by training and profession. And so she was able to do research that would not have been accessible to many people, to go back to the basic science and really try to understand cellular health and mitochondrial function and all these things. And, watching her recovery, and I don't think that she would use the word cure. I think she would say recovery and treating her symptoms and those kinds of things. But the way that she's been able to um, change her diet, change her lifestyle to, have a significant increase in her health compared to the trajectory that she was on when I was a teenager has obviously been remarkable to watch, and without doubt, one of the greatest joys of my life, watching her be able to get back on the bicycle, watch her being able to start walking for longer and longer distances, to watch her play with my son, Eli, now, and watching her enjoy being a grandma. Is truly one of life's greatest blessings.
What do you think that impacted you? Because my parents are getting older. I've seen kind of my grandparents go down as they get older, their health and mental and physical health decline. And I'm wondering how you, as a public servant who kind of went through that experience with one of your moms, and then, saw her come back, how how does that impact your, I guess, your approach or maybe your perspective when you're working with these different communities, whether it's people who are caregivers or people suffering from different types of illnesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things for me is it is an encouragement to be willing to question the status quo and to be willing to push and to try new things and innovate. Look, I not everybody's health recovers if they get on the Walls protocol. She I think is very clear eyed that what worked for her doesn't always work for everybody else. It's worked for many people, but that isn't necessarily proof positive that it'll work for everybody else. I do think it underscores the fact that we do need more research into nutrition as a field. I think it's woefully understudied relative to its importance in people's day-to-day lives. And I do think that from my perspective, it is again this kind of core, you know, belief that it's not over until you know you either die or quit, right? And her willingness, or she woke up. I remember getting it myself early for high school sports. And she'd be up at 5 o'clock just like me. Doing some very very light exercises, trying to preserve what strength she had left. Not even to like recover, but to just slow her decline. Which you talk about like motivation. That's like a hard thing I think for a lot of people um, to kind of get excited about, but that was what she was focused on, just doing everything that she could. And I think that was a thing that she really raised me with from an early age was, she's a big Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl's one of her favorite books growing up, and just the ability of individual people to make choices that affect their lives. And look, I'm someone who believes very much in trying to understand structural forces and how systems affect people. But I don't think that we should ever underestimate the power that an individual can exercise in determining their own life.
I feel like when you see somebody that's pushing through on a like on a daily basis, it kind of changes you. It makes you inspired and kind of shows you what's possible. And Man's Search for Meaning that's one of my favorite books because it's like, if anybody who's listening hasn't read it, they definitely should because it really reframes pretty much everything. There's one quote that's like, if basically if I was like 80 years old and, just not in good shape anymore and I could go back to this moment and make a decision, what decision do I wish I would have made? And just different things like that, like making the best out of your situation and not just kind of accepting things the way that they are.
It's an incredible book. It's a relatively quick read. It's not a light read, but it is I found it to be a very powerful book.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you you're a dad now. 15, you say 15 months?
You got it.
15 months. How has things changed for you? Because right now you're serving in the Iowa Senate, you're running for US Senate, and you're a new dad. And I'm sure you have other normal responsibilities just like everyone else. So how do you manage all of this?
Yeah, it's funny. So we launched our campaign on Wednesday, June 11th, and Wednesday night is trash night. So like we get through launching the Senate campaign, it's been a wild day, and at the end of the day, Chloe's like, "Hey, you got to take out the trash," just like a reminder that life doesn't stop, chores don't stop just because you're taking on new professional responsibilities.
Yeah.
And so that was a very kind of funny way to cap off that first day. But yeah, look, becoming a dad has been an incredible journey. It's something that I've wanted kids for basically as long as I can remember. And so my wife and I were thrilled to welcome baby Elijah 15 months ago in March of 2024. And he's been walking now for 6-8 weeks here, and it's been just a joy and keeps me on my toes. I'm definitely getting my steps in, and watching the human mind just grow and develop, and frankly for me, just kind of unlocking new depths of emotion and love that I don't think I really fully had experienced before. The feeling of him falling asleep on your chest, when you're rocking him to sleep or getting him to settle down is just one of the greatest things I've ever experienced as a father and as a man. And so I feel very, very blessed to have welcomed him into our lives. And certainly for Chloe and me, it gives us a new perspective on the work that we do. And it was a part of when we were reflecting on whether or not we should launch this campaign earlier this year, thinking about what kind of world are we leaving for Eli and his generation, certainly was a part of that consideration for us. And I think it's a common experience for lots of parents. Just helps you zoom out a little bit in terms of your own life and try to see the bigger picture.
How has it changed or has it changed your perspective on any of your policies or platforms or how you're approaching things moving forward?
I don't know if it's really changed my perceptions. Maybe it's given me new understanding of the importance of some of these issues. So,
Mhm.
family medical leave is a great example. There are so many families across the country who don't have paid family leave. So they have a child, they can have unpaid leave, but most families can't afford not to work for months or longer at a time. And so I think it's, when the Congress was debating paid family leave a few years ago, they didn't wind up passing it, which I think was an absolute missed opportunity. Especially, we look at how many families struggle to pay for childcare. Iowa, where I live, has one of the frankly worst childcare systems in the country, is rated by some outside experts. We feel very fortunate that we found a great daycare center that's not too far
Yeah.
from where we live, but we're paying almost as much for daycare as we are for our mortgage.
Yeah.
And we're not building equity in the daycare center, right? And so
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, as we think about all of the challenges facing young Iowa families, all too often I hear from my peers where the number of kids they can have is limited to the number of kids they feel like they can afford rather than a number of kids they actually want. And I think that's an enormous policy failure in this country.
It's I read that on your site, or maybe it was an email that you had sent out about the cost, and I mean I don't have any kids, so I had no idea. It was kind of shocking to me. Like in my mind, I'm thinking like I don't know what the average salary is in Iowa off the top of my head, or average income, but just I mean, how can any family really afford that is sitting at that average or below?
Well, and I think the challenge in particular is you look at, one, so the fact that most families, by definition, are earlier in their careers, and so
Mhm.
lower on the income scale relative to where you might be later in your life. Um, Two, some families look at how expensive childcare is and decide that it makes more sense for one parent to stay home with the kids. The challenge is that also creates lost economic opportunity down the line, where if you take 3, 4, 5 years off from work and you've now lost out on incremental pay increases over that time, you try to rejoin the labor force at your previous salary, that compounds over time, right?
Mhm.
To say nothing of, not being able to keep your skills up to date or your knowledge base or whatever you're working on. There are real costs for families, no matter what you do. And again, that's just where I think that as a state and as a country, we need to be doing way more to support young
Mhm.
families, because that's part of the price of living in a society, right? When we talk about how it takes a village, so this is part of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I've been all over so my wife is from India, and I've kind of seen how like I've been to a lot of different places and seen how like the family unit works together to raise kids, and I've found it to be so fascinating to see like how things are in different places where you have some that the mom and dad get a year off of work, paid year off of work. Somebody can fact check me and tell me I'm wrong, but I think it's somewhere in like the Baltic. Yeah,
Yeah, the Nordic states, yeah. So like Sweden, Finland, yeah, it's not
yeah,
uncommon. Yeah, and look, you know, I think 12 months is probably a hard sell in this country, although I'll tell you, I only had 6 weeks of paid family leave, and that did not feel like nearly enough time. My wife was fortunate to have, a little bit longer, but again, from my perspective, you have both the issue of paid family leave at the beginning to make sure that you can
uh-huh,
bond with your child and be there to support, each other through, the recovery process postpartum. My wife and I did sleep shifts. I would highly recommend to you, and any other prospective parent, those first, 6 weeks for us, you know, uh, like making sure that you can get enough sleep is actually super important. So we would do,
mhm,
6 to 7 hour sleep shifts each night, like 9 to 3 and then 3 to 9. So we would each get a little bit of uninterrupted sleep, every night, which was super, super helpful. Um, and then we're really fortunate. My parents live a 15-minute drive away. They love being grandparents. They help out a lot. I don't think that we would be able to do what we are doing with the Senate campaign without the support of my parents and my sister Zeb, who's loving being an aunt. So we've been really blessed with strong family support, which really does make a big difference.
Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference. Like seeing people who don't have that versus ones who have, 6 people helping out. It just like the stress on the mom and especially, and then like I think the ability for the kid to be constantly engaged with someone where you can kind of trade off who's entertaining the kids for a period of time. And I think I wish people could see like what was possible in some of these other places because I really feel for the folks that don't have that support system. So I wanted to ask you, so when it comes to specifics, like how do you address and solve that problem? Where
Yeah, look, I don't think there's a single policy that you can pass that's going to solve the problem overall. The first thing is to decide that it is a problem that needs to be addressed, right? There are a patchwork of different policies that are currently in place at the state level, at the federal level, at the local government level. And I think one of the things that we need to decide is, look, young families are oftentimes in a relatively vulnerable position. They deserve our support as a community. We have K-12 schools that provide, which are paid for with property taxes and some state and federal funding. We have this K-12 system that supports kids that when they get to, 5 years old.
Sure.
It's kind of wild, actually, that we have less support for kids age 0 to 5 than we do for kids once they get to kindergarten. I think that there's a bunch of different things that you could do. I think that we have programs like Head Start that are important for a lot of, lower and middle income families. We have, if for the state of Iowa, childcare assistance that helps families afford childcare if they are lower income. There have been, kind of step pieces here and there along the way at the federal level to try and figure out how do we get more kids into subsidized, daycare programs where they can have access to, enrichment and learning and peer support. That emotional development is really important for young children. But the first thing comes with deciding that it's an issue that we're going to work on as a society to solve. Obviously, the paid family leave is important. If you think like literally sequentially, right? Paid family leave is really important. Another thing that isn't talked about as often, but that I think can also make a real difference is nurse visits. So many families, including mine, we set up doctor's appointments. We go see the doctor or pediatrician, on kind of a regular set of intervals. Not every family has the ability to do that for reasons related to work, transportation, what have you. They don't have a pediatrician right out of the gate. And so there's a great organization called the Nurse Family Partnership where they will actually bring a nurse to the home to do the checkups and help the parents learn how to do kind of certain functions if they haven't learned that already. Expanding things like that, right? I think one of the reasons why there isn't a one size fits all solution is that not all families are the same. But again, it starts first and foremost by deciding this is a real problem and it deserves our attention and our energy as a country to actually increase the outcomes here. And I think the last point I would make on that is simply that we know for a fact that there are very few opportunities for a greater return on government investment than supporting our young kids. Because when you have that support for young kids, it has all of these positive effects throughout their aging and development. They're less likely to wind up interacting with the criminal justice system, more likely to have a higher paying job as they get older, less likely to need medical care, those kinds of things.
Yeah, so I feel like in my mind I'm seeing a couple different. So you have kind of the camp of people who are well off and they can afford daycare without really any issues, or they have some level of support system, and from their perspective they're probably thinking like, why do we need this? And then on the other side you have folks who are on the other side of like the economic spectrum, and they're gonna be like, I don't want my taxes to go up. How can we also add this in, without seeing our expenses go up? So how do you sell both of those sides that this is a problem? I mean, I'm sure the folks on the lower side of the economic spectrum see it as a problem, but how do you kind of bridge that perspective gap and get everyone kind of on board to do something about this?
Well, I think anyone who's ever had a kid will be able to tell you that it's not easy and it requires a lot of work. I think one thing, I was actually just on another interview last week and I got a question kind of to this vein. I think a lot of folks who are older who don't have young kids have no idea how expensive childcare is today. They just have not stayed, informed about how much more expensive childcare has become over time. And so I think there's an educational component to it of making sure that people understand that it's not like kids these days are just kind of coming up with a new problem or whatever. It's like, no, this has actually become very expensive, and there are fewer slots available than there have been in the past, and those kinds of things. So that's one piece. I think that again, from this question of, how do you pay for it without costs going up or taxes going up, what have you? I mean, look, I don't have any compunction about saying that those people who are very well off should be paying a higher marginal tax rate. There have been attempts over time to just dramatically cut taxes from the very top, 1%. And those marginal tax rates have fallen dramatically. And currently in Washington, D.C., there's an enormous debate going on about whether or not they're going to extend those tax cuts for ultra millionaires and billionaires in DC. And at the same time that they're proposing to cut those taxes, they're also proposing to cut very important basic programs that everyday Iowans depend on and that are there for us when times are tough. The reason why we have Medicaid, the reason that we have the food stamp program or SNAP is for when Iowans are struggling and when you need help getting back on your feet. You need support through a tough time. And so to me, it's just like totally, frankly, unbelievable that they're even proposing this, let alone that it looks like they're probably going to pass it. And so from my perspective, the question is not just about like, what can you afford? It's like, what are your priorities? And I think one of our priorities should be, supporting young families and making sure that the next generation gets off to the strongest start possible.
Yeah, it probably has like ripple effects throughout their entire life. They become a healthier, more, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. They contribute more to society.
In so many ways, right? And in Iowa, we know that you reap what you sow.
Yeah.
The question is, what are we sowing?
Yeah. I feel like I have this conversation around dinner tables often when I'm in Iowa, where it's like somebody brings up that the ultra wealthy should get taxed more. And then I feel like there's this aversion from like middle class folks to do that for some reason. And in my mind, I'm like I'm trying so hard to like logically explain why it makes sense, but I don't know if it's the sound of taxes going up at all for anyone that gives people this kind of aversion to support some of these things. Or I don't know. Do you have a thumb on the pulse of why there seems to be some resistance to that?
Well, I think the primary resistance comes from elected officials in Washington, D.C., whose campaigns are funded by those same, very wealthy millionaires and billionaires. And that's where the real problem is. I think, most middle class folks, understand that, when it comes to funding, yes, these essential services, that, yeah, the wealthy should pay their fair share. In part because they have the most to lose, right? I mean, I think this is like a pretty, they have the most, kind of economic, I mean, they're the ones who have the money, right? And so I don't understand kind of what the concern is there in that regard. But I think that from this broader question, right, of how do we have a strong, well-funded government, right? We all pay our taxes, right? Almost every Iowan pays a relatively substantial amount of taxes every year. Whether that's sales tax when you're buying something at the grocery store, property taxes if you're a homeowner, and if you're a renter, even if you're not paying property taxes on your own apartment, like your rent is contributing to the property tax for the person who owns the building. Obviously income taxes, there's no shortage of taxes in life, right? And then the question becomes, when you have those resources, what are your priorities? And that's where, again, I think the primary priorities, I think our kids, our next generation, making sure that we're providing essential services, we're taking care of the roads, the bridges, and then that we're providing for a fair, retirement and economic security for our elders and seniors is really important, right? And that's something that I think those have been kind of core democratic beliefs for a long time. And the question is simply, are we going to stay committed to those ideals?
This brings me to a question I'm really curious about. So you've been working in the state legislation in Iowa for quite some time, and it's very heavily GOP. So you were the minority Senate leader for a period of time. And I'm sure there's been some things that you would have liked to have seen pass and some things that you maybe wish you didn't see pass. And it's probably been challenging on some days. So how do you basically keep hope, like a positive attitude? How do you approach this so you feel like that there's a light at the end of the tunnel? So some of the policies and things that you want to accomplish, um, like you still believe they're possible. I guess the big question is like, how do you keep from getting stuck when things don't go your way?
Great question. So, look, I think first you gotta make sure you take care of yourself. Anyone who has a high stress job or career, right? I think that making sure that you're keeping your cup full or filling your battery, whatever metaphor you want to use, is super important. So I like to exercise regularly, try to do some deep breathing, um, and those are things for me that just help me stay energized and feeling like I can get through the day. Good for stress relief, right?
Yeah.
And then I think I'd actually some of it would go back to what we were talking about earlier with Viktor Frankl, and really trying to stay focused on the things that you can control, understanding there are lots of things that I can't control, right? That's especially true in politics.
Yeah.
And if you get too stressed or worked up or focused on things that are beyond your ability to influence, you're gonna have a bad time. And if you stay instead focused on the things where your effort and your energy can move the needle and make the difference, you're gonna feel better, is my experience, right? And so I do my best to just stay grounded and focused on those places where I feel like my effort can really make an impact. And sometimes, right, that's on the political side, on the elections piece, whether that's going out to campaign for colleagues of mine, knocking doors, meeting voters where they are, is one of my very favorite things to do. I knocked on a huge number of doors in my very first state Senate race back in 2018. And it's one of the things that I'm the most looking forward to with this newly launched campaign for the US Senate. Or once you're in office, making sure that you're actually doing your job, which is standing up for the values and fighting for the issues that your constituents sent you to fight for, and then working across the aisle on the issues where there actually is opportunity for bipartisan agreement and where you can actually find opportunities to collaborate and work with people, even if they're in a different political party. And that's the thing that I've always tried to do as a legislator. And even though, I'm from a more Democratic leaning county and I am myself a Democrat, I've always thought that there are good people on the other side of the aisle who, even though we see the world differently, care a lot about our state, which is the only reason why you would run for office in the first place, and who are willing to work together on issues that affect everyday Iowans.
There was something you mentioned before about how people were kind of, I guess maybe disenfranchised is the best word I can think of, where people are on both sides of the aisle find themselves often frustrated. I mean, you had basically unlimited amount of choices in front of you and you went into public service. If someone's listening to this interview and they feel frustrated with the way things are going, whether it's federally at the state level in their own community, what advice would you have to them for how they can get involved and start to make an impact, whether it's could be running for office or just simply starting by helping out your elderly neighbors? Like, what do you tell that person that's, they're doom scrolling on their phone, like, oh no, not another one of these.
Yeah. Totally. Well, look, I mean, a few things. First of all, I very much believe that from those to whom much is given, much is expected. And when I was given these enormous gifts, frankly, early in life with this viral speech and this opportunity to be an advocate, I knew that I had a responsibility to pay that forward, essentially. The other piece of that, of course, is that, like I said earlier, I learned at a very early age that politics was interested in families like mine, which is part of why I got interested in politics. And so there's definitely, a certain amount of I remember how hard families like mine had to fight to get a seat at the table. And part of the reason why I wanted to run for office was because I thought that my constituents deserved to have somebody who was willing to fight as hard for their family, as I had fought for my own, and I knew that I could do. I think the most important thing about politics for your listeners to understand is that it really is determined by the people who show up. If you want to get involved with the campaign, there are so many opportunities to do that. If there's anyone listening who wants to volunteer for my campaign, they can just go to zachwahls.com. We've got a great volunteer page. We're going to be building out our grassroots organizing operation here over the summer. And I'll tell you, I'm really glad you asked the question, because one of the things is I was reflecting earlier this year, thinking about this campaign. Do we want to do this? And if we do it, how do we want to run the campaign? And here in my office hanging over my shoulder, I got my Eagle Scout certificate. I loved my time in scouting, and it might sound a little old fashioned, but I still really try to live by those scouting values. And one of those most important things that I learned in scouting was you have to leave things better than you found it. And so one of the things that we've really decided to do with this campaign, we're going to have a lot of political activity to do, door knocking, phone banking, all of that stuff that goes into a campaign. But we also want to take some of the volunteer energy from the campaign and start serving Iowa communities right out of the gate. Because I think that's what people expect from their elected officials. And to the extent that a campaign is a job interview, I want to show people rather than just tell people how I'll lead as a member of the U.S. Senate. So we want to start volunteering, serving Iowa communities now during the campaign. I'm hoping that we can inspire those folks who are maybe doom scrolling to stop looking at their news feeds and roll up their sleeves and get involved with the campaign. I'll tell you, Trevor, there's nothing that makes me feel better about politics than actually getting out and talking with voters. It is my favorite part of campaigning, is meeting people at their doorstep and listening to them talk about their challenges and finding opportunities to connect what we're doing with the campaign to actual problems that they have in their own lives. And so that's exactly the mentality that we're trying to bring to the campaign, but we can't do it alone, right? We need a grassroots movement of people across the state and supporters from across the country to be a part of what we're trying to do. And I fundamentally believe, and I wouldn't be doing this campaign if I didn't think this, I fundamentally believe that there is nothing that is wrong with our state that can't be fixed by what is right with our state. And our state has enormous challenges right now. I mean, we are 48th in personal income, 49th in state GDP, dead last in our economy, rising cancer rates. We have enormous challenges facing Iowa, but there is nothing that is wrong with our state that can't be fixed by what is right with our state.
Yeah, that's you reminded me a little bit of there was the prime minister election in Canada here recently where when there was the talks of annexation and all that business, and that resulted in the conservative leader who had a pretty massive lead losing to the Liberal Party. And I think he kind of stuck with the tone that Canada's broken. And then the other guy came in and was just like, no, like we're all Canadians, we're going to do this together. And I think that that's a really positive message, is that even if things are broken, having the hope and belief that they can get better and be fixed is something that's kind of missing a little bit right now. So it's good to hear that.
100%, right? I mean, like, I think hope is so important in life. It's an important part of my faith. And I think that for our state, it is something that we need badly right now because we have these really serious challenges. And unfortunately, our leaders in Washington, D.C. seem to be completely disconnected from the reality that we're facing in our state. And I don't think that you can look somebody in the eye and saying you're doing a good job when your state's being ranked dead last in terms of the economy. I mean, that to me is what failed leadership looks like, plain and simple.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll ask you a few questions on some Iowa issues. One for me that I see a lot, because I don't have the stats in front of me, but I know that Ida County is I'm from Ida Grove, and Ida County is pretty bad on the cancer rates and like how fast they're growing, and how I just see the impact it has on people's families. I feel like this is even like a kind of a contentious issue about like water and everything, because when the stuff with Des Moines happened, 2 weeks ago, with the nitrate levels being extremely high.
It's still ongoing at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was I believe it was like a local congressman who made a video explaining everything. And the first thing that people were replying was like, don't blame the farmers. It's these other people's fault. So as soon as you start to address that there's an issue, all of a sudden the wagons get circled and people get defensive, and instead of working together to find the problem, they kind of just be like, well, don't blame us. It's not our fault. And then nothing really gets done. So how do you tackle the water quality and cancer is one issue, but I feel like it's kind of a blanket problem overall right now. So how do you tackle these issues when you have different parties who have, how do I say this? I'm trying to say it now.
Yeah, well, they see the problem differently, right? I mean, look,
Yeah.
because a thing that is fundamentally true about human beings is that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are, right? It is a reflection of our own experiences and our lives and our views on things. And this is a perfect illustration of that, right? So look, obviously the cancer rates are what they are. I don't think there's anybody who can deny the data on that. We're one of, I think, only 2 states in the country where cancer rates are rising rather than decreasing, and they're rising faster here than anywhere else. So it's an enormous challenge. It affects the lives of almost every Iowan personally. I have close friends, family members who have been affected by cancer, who lost their lives to cancer. It is something that touches all of us. I understand that there are different viewpoints on what the source is or what the problems are. What I think that we should all agree on is that it is a problem, and that the idea that, just because there's some disagreement about what's causing it should prevent us from doing something about it is absolutely absurd. I do think that one of the challenges is people do get defensive because they think that if farmers are responsible, then the government's going to come in. They're going to try to change how we farm. They're going to change our operation. Da, 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 da. And look, I don't think that people like being told how to farm any more than parents like being told how to raise their kids, right? Like, I understand that concern for sure. I do think that just because I think the other thing too that a lot of people who live in town don't understand is that farmers really are literally the textbook definition of price takers. They don't get to set the price for their corn or their beans or, their cattle or their pork, right? I mean, the market sets those prices, then they have to kind of try to adjust and respond, in their operation. We've had, the ag economy's been through some really hard stretches here in the last couple of years. And so the idea that they'd be facing additional regulation on top of the turmoil that's been happening in the markets, I think is really scary to a lot of farmers, and understandably so. And so I think that we need to be looking at this problem through the lens of, okay, I don't think that there's any farmer in this state or in this country, frankly, who would like to be in a situation where the way that they are growing their food or raising their livestock is going to make themselves or their family or their community or their fellow, Iowans sick. Nobody wants that, right? And so the question is, at a federal level, how do you have a farm bill that is actually going to support farmers, producers, growers who are trying to do the right thing? Where are there opportunities for us to change how the market is structured to actually incentivize practices that are going to lead to higher water quality, that are going to lead to less cancer? Understanding that those changes have to be made at a federal level in order to actually affect everybody rather than just disadvantaging one state or another. Because if you try to do it just, it is a much harder problem to solve at the state level than at the federal level. And you're talking about a $1.5 trillion industry that, in federal agriculture policy touches virtually every producer in the country. So that's how I think about it. I understand that there's concern. I've heard this in the rural parts of our state about chemicals that are being put on golf courses or on lawns and what have you in town. And look, I think that you should take those seriously, but I don't think that you can let differing views on what the source of the problem is get in the way of trying to actually do something about it. And that's, again, the fact that we're now several years overdue on passing an updated farm bill is another illustration, I think, of the failed leadership in Washington, D.C., and why it's time for us to rotate the crops.
That's a funny way of saying that. Okay, so you mentioned you've been doing a lot of door knocking, or you're going to be doing a lot of door knocking for your campaign. I want to ask you a very specific scenario. So you're door knocking. Maybe you're in Western Iowa somewhere. You knock on someone's door. That's they're a mom, a teacher. They live on a farm. They say they're an independent voter, but most likely they voted GOP every election for the past few cycles. They're probably going to be skeptical as soon as they hear that you are running as a Democrat. How do you convince them that you're the best person for the job, and how do you connect with them on the issues that they believe are important?
I think the first thing in any conversation with a voter is to try to look for common ground. I think, unfortunately, one of the biggest problems in our politics right now is that you have people who try to say that Democrats and Republicans hate each other, they disagree on every issue. And look, there are definitely people in both parties who are reflexively kind of disagree with people from the other party. My experience has always been that if you look for common ground, you might be surprised at how much you can find. Because at the end of the day, most people want a lot of the same things, right? We want our families to be happy and healthy and safe, and ideally nearby, right? We want our communities to be thriving and if not, growing in the same way that like Des Moines is growing, kind of gangbusters at the very least, prosperous enough to sustain the people who live there. We want good schools. We want nearby healthcare, right? There are a lot of these things that we all can agree on. And you have to start by looking for those things. If this person, is a parent, right? If they're a teacher, let's talk about family. Let's talk about public education. Let's talk about supporting, young families, middle-class families. And there are going to be differences of opinion on some topics, right? And by the way, this isn't just a problem that Democrats experience. When I was first running for the state Senate in 2018, I represented two counties that were counties that had been supportive of Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, and then flipped to supporting Donald Trump in 2016. And one of the things that I heard from people all the time was, I don't agree with Donald Trump on every issue, but I trust that he cares about my family. He's willing to stand up to the establishment. And that's something that really made an impression on me, right? Is that people don't necessarily expect to agree with you on every issue, but if they trust that you're willing to fight on their behalf against the entrenched interests that they think are holding them back, they'll be willing to consider voting for you. As a legislator, I have always done my best to fight back against the entrenched interests that are hurting Iowa families. To give you one example, my first year, we saw these out-of-state companies come in from Utah and purchase mobile home and manufactured housing communities, trailer parks across Iowa, including several in my own district. And these are, these large companies backed by private equity, huge amounts of money, buying these communities and then raising the rent on my constituents 50, 60, 70% one year or 1 month to the next. That's not a Democratic issue or Republican issue. That is a basic issue of right and wrong, right? And so we went to work on that topic. I was able to work across the aisle. We took on the powerful lobbyists from this industry. We beat them in the Senate. Unfortunately, they won the day in the Iowa House, so that did not become law. But it was an early education for me that you have to be willing to fight and say no to the lobbyists and to the special interests whose clients are screwing over way too many Iowa families.
Yeah.
And that is a perfect example of, you have all these folks in these communities, most of whom are either retired or working in jobs that are long hours, not enough pay, and they're just trying to stay afloat. And then they get this anchor placed around their neck. And it's a perfect illustration of what's wrong with our politics. And so obviously the example that you provided isn't exactly necessarily someone from that situation, but it's indicative of the kind of leaders who we need in our politics right now, because so many of the problems in our economy that are limiting opportunity for people like moms with a family of four are these real issues in the economy. And those issues persist because of the influence that they have through what is a corrupt political establishment that I've had the courage to stand up against before. And that's exactly what I'll do in Washington.
Yeah. I think that throughout your career, you've had quite a few opportunities to do that, like with Boy Scout advocacy. And then I'm just imagining that somebody, you say you stand up to the special interests and you have some of these examples, but then someone says, Zach, you've been a state senator for 7 years now. So if you've been there for 7 years, how does that make you different from the other folks who've been in Washington for that long or in the state for that long? Would they start to assume you're part of the establishment now? And what do you say to somebody who thinks that?
Yeah, sure. Well, so you mentioned earlier that I was the Senate Minority Leader. That was true. I was the youngest ever Senate Minority Leader, and now I'm the youngest ever former Senate Minority Leader. Because I had, the willingness to say to my colleagues, look, we need to dramatically change the way that Iowa Democrats are operating in the state, because what we're doing isn't working. And Iowans are being very clear with us that they do not like what we have to offer. I think there are way too many people in my party who've gotten to a point where they are, they think that they have all the answers. They think that they don't need to go to rural Iowa. They don't need to go out to our small towns. They don't need to engage farmers. They don't need to listen to what people are telling them. And I just completely disagree with that. And I said to my colleagues, like, we need to make some really serious changes. And now I'm the former Senate Democratic leader. And so I have a record of trying to take on my party and get us back to a point where we're actually meeting Iowans where they are. I have done my very best as a state senator to stay really focused on doing the job to the best of my ability. What does that mean? A couple of things. So first is you have to stay connected to people in the community. I've always done my best to go to legislative forums, to hold town halls, to attend community events, to be very accessible to people. And that's something that I've really prided myself on, just because I again, as someone who's still relatively young, grew up online, big believer in transparency, being accessible. We've always done our best to do those things. And we're trying to bring that same energy to this campaign. It means really prioritizing constituent service. When folks reach out and they ask for help, If I can't help them because it's a federal issue or a local government issue, I don't just say, oh, that's not my problem. I try to connect them to somebody who can help get that problem solved. And then I make sure I stay on top of my staff to make sure that we are driving these cases to being completed and doing the best of our ability to help out where we can. And then, I would say that the final thing is trying to campaign in a way where, again, you can meet people where they are. And so I gave you the example of door knocking, but there's all kinds of other ways that that looks. And so those are kind of the three core things that I've tried to do in my time as a legislator. I've taken on my own party when I disagree with them. I've got the scars to show for it, and I'll never hesitate to do it again when I think it's right for Iowa. And also, the last piece of it is, again, being willing to work across the aisle, because I don't think that Democrats have a monopoly on good ideas. I think a lot of ideas that are good for our state aren't particularly partisan one way or another. And I have a lot of Republican colleagues who, even though we might disagree on, you know, abortion access or tax cuts for the ultra wealthy or what have you, right? There are places where we can work together, and you should always be willing to do that because that's the job, right? That's the job.
Mhm. How do you approach those conversations with those folks across the aisle who you might have some common ground, but then there are some things where you just see the world completely differently? Because I think that from a normal person perspective, everything seems as divided as it's probably ever been in a lot of our lifetimes. So how do you? I feel like you have a very difficult job in doing this because you have to be able to connect with those people that see it a bit differently, and you also have to make sure that it doesn't, for the people that you are representing, it doesn't feel like you're leaving the values that they chose you for behind by working with people that they see things differently with. So how do you walk that line? That seems that seems like a very challenging task overall.
Well, the first thing I would say is I think the vast majority of Iowans expect their elected officials to work together on the areas where they agree. I think that's just a thing that's true, regardless of what party affiliation you have, Republican, Democrat, no party, third party, right? I think the vast majority of Iowans expect their legislators to do that because that's the job. Uh, when it comes to actually doing that, one of the things I learned early in life is that when it comes to respect, you have to give it in order to get it. And so finding, even if you have strong disagreements on policy, every person who's in that chamber in the state Senate, they were elected by their constituents and the people who live in that district to represent them. So you're not just interacting with another senator, you are electing with the elected, chosen, senator from that district whose political power comes from the people. And so if you believe in democracy, and I do, then you should bring a certain level of respect to the person who holds that office, right? I think the institution expects that. I do think that one of the challenges in our politics right now is that a lot of the political incentives have gotten a little out of whack, right? A big part of that comes from how our campaign finance system is structured, which is why I support overturning Citizens United and having comprehensive campaign finance reform, because you get to this point where you have people doing things to get attention in order to raise money, but that aren't actually solving the problems and in fact are making some problems harder to solve, right? You have a Congress now in Washington, D.C., and this has been true through both parties, that is unfortunately increasingly relying on very, very thin majorities to pass very sweeping pieces of legislation, including the one that's currently going through Washington right now, that'll have dramatic changes to how social services are delivered in this country with these razor thin, majorities, and that's creating real challenges. I think it's easy to look back on this with hindsight being 2020, but back when President Biden was in office, there was a time when they were debating, the American Rescue Plan, and Republicans came, offering their support on a slightly smaller package, but it would have made it more bipartisan. And I think in hindsight, they probably should have taken that deal more seriously, right? And tried to figure out a way to make that more common ground. So the last piece I'll say on this is that the partisanship problem is not really exclusively Democratic or Republican. It is a kind of a tribal issue that is affecting more than just politics in our society, right? In Iowa, in particular, in the state legislature, you have seen Republicans, which control both chambers, act in very, very partisan ways. And the only thing that I always try to remind people is that the way things have been is not the way that things have to be, right?
Yep.
We can choose for things to be different, right? We're frustrated. We don't like how politics makes us feel. We want to feel better about politics. We can choose that. And that's what we're trying to do with this campaign.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you brought up Citizens United as well, because if anybody's listening and doesn't know what that is, they should educate themselves on it. If they want to know when things really started to go off the rails, that's a great starting point. And there was a poll I saw, or maybe it was on Reddit or something, where they were like, all right, liberals and conservatives, find something that you agree on. And then everyone was like, get money out of politics now. And it was very bipartisan. I feel like that's a very good common ground issue. So I have two more questions for you, and then we can wrap this up. The first one is, so Iowa has a legacy of like picking their senators or their politicians and sticking with them for a very long time. You have like Harkin, Wesley. I'm not sure how many terms Branstad did, but I feel like he was the
Longest ever in the country. Longest serving governor of all time in the U.S.
We don't like change, I guess. So knowing all that, let's say that you're elected and you get into you're representing Iowa in the U.S. Senate. What do you want to be remembered for when your term's done, and you're walking into the sunlight as a successful senator? What do you hope people remember about you and your term?
Well, Trevor, one thing I'll tell you is that I believe in term limits for our elected leaders. One of the reasons for that is I think if you stay too long, it's very easy. Now, this isn't true for everybody, but it's very easy to become way too cozy with the special interests that are a big part of the challenge facing our state and our country. And so I've said publicly that if I'm elected to the U.S. Senate, I'll only serve 2 terms. So it's a total of 12 years. I think you can get a lot done in 12 years. I think that the kind of the key thing for me is making sure that we're fighting for a fairer economy. That is the single most important reason of why I'm running. That is going to be the thing that I work on the most if I'm elected. It's unacceptable for Iowa to be last in the country when it comes to our economy. I think obviously we've already touched a little bit on some of the healthcare issues, in particular cancer, and making sure that we're doing more to combat that. I do think that cleaning up our water and having an ag economy that actually is working for farmers and for our entire state is super important. All 3 of those issues are really linked together, right? And then we touched on it just a moment ago, trying to clean up the corruption in our politics. I think it's absolutely shameful that elected officials are allowed to trade on inside information. I've introduced legislation in the state Senate to ban that, and I would certainly co-sponsor that legislation at the federal level as well. And so I think, the kind of the through line in all of that is trying to restore trust in government, and the idea that government is of, by, and for the people, and the government's supposed to work for we the people rather than the other way around.
Yeah. All right, last one for you, and then we'll wrap it up. So if for anybody who's listening, who's maybe looking for some inspiration, whether it's from, they want to get involved in their community, whether it's there's something that they're really passionate about and they want to do something about or advocate for. If you had one piece of advice for that aspiring person, what would it be?
I think the most important thing is just do it. Nike got it right on that one. Don't wait around until you have the perfect idea or the perfect solution, or the perfect organization. Just get after it. Obviously you shouldn't rush into something that is too big for you to take on your own. But I think that so many of life's problems come from worrying about things rather than just taking action to start working on the thing itself. That is an approach that has guided me and served me very well over the last 15 years. And I always try to make sure that people know you can just do things. You don't have to wait until the perfect opportunity comes along. You can roll up your sleeves and get after it.
Yeah, exactly.
And if they want to get involved with our campaign, they can go to zachwahls.com to learn more.
That's what I was just going to ask you. So if they want to know anything more about your campaign, Zach, where do they go?
I'm also on all the major social media platforms, except Truth Social, I guess. I don't know if that counts as a major social media platform. Maybe we should be on Truth Social.
Hey, man, if you want to talk to some people who probably aren't in the same, who are just in a different camp, then it's probably a great place, but they keep getting hacked. So I don't know.
Yeah, maybe not.
All right. Well, thanks again, Zach, for taking the time to come and chat today, and be looking forward to see how your campaign plays out.
Thanks, Trevor.
I hope you enjoyed that podcast as much as I did. If you want to support the show, head to trevorcarlson.com, where you can find out a little bit more about my book. And if you want to support it, I think that we're taking pre-orders at this point, so you can find out more there. It's a dream I've had to become a fiction author since I was a kid. So this is me taking my shot. We've already sold a good number of copies through our Kickstarter campaign. It wasn't a record breaker like Brandon Sanderson's, but I was pretty happy that I was able to sell at least a few books there. If you want to know more about any of the articles coming out, videos, podcasts, head to trevorcarlson.com, subscribe to the email newsletter, and look forward to seeing you on the next video.